Imagine a quiet park where a peaceful day is suddenly overshadowed by a grim event. A young black girl is just strolling along, enjoying the fresh air, when her tranquility is disturbed by an unfamiliar man, a janitor, with a surly look and obvious prejudice. He starts harassing her, showing his racist tendencies. But as it turns out later, he made a terrible mistake. The man soon discovers who her uncle is, at which point his courage evaporates, giving way to fear and despair. What happens next? Stay tuned for this tense denouement. In the meantime, friends, write in the comments what your name is and what city you're from. We read every comment and want to learn about each of you. You are incredibly important to us. It is your support that helps our channel grow and reach new heights. Thank you for sticking with us. Your presence truly inspires us to keep going. We appreciate each and every one of you and are glad to have you with us along the way. Enjoy the show. The foggy morning enveloped the park like a harbinger of something evil. The branches of the trees leaned over the empty alleys, and the thick, damp air held movement in place, creating a sense of still unease. It was quiet all around, as if nature itself was holding its breath, preparing to be a mute witness to what was happening. The park, usually full of light and laughter, seemed gloomy and unfriendly at this hour. There wasn't a soul on the benches, only lonely leaves swirling gently in the silent air, as if slowly pointing out the path not to follow. The barely audible rumble of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance suddenly cut through the silence, breaking the oppressive atmosphere. It was a sound that seemed normal, but on this day it sounded different. Like a warning, like a hint of something dark lurking beneath this seeming serenity. A light breeze blew across the empty paths, sliding over the rusty fences of the playground and swaying the long-faded swings with a slight creak. Everything looked normal, but there was something unsettling lurking in the shadows of the trees. It was as if the park knew that something bad was about to happen here, and as if it didn't want to let in light and joy. At the very edge of the park, strewn with orange and brown leaves, stood a janitor named Roy, a man with a tired, gaunt face whose wrinkles held shadows of his prejudice and malice. Roy was a regular laborer who had spent years sweeping these paths and tending the trees and lawns, but all the while he had been invisibly watching those who came to the park, judging them, as he believed, on their own merits. For him, each visitor was a kind of riddle, which he solved in his own way, immediately categorizing people into categories that were once and for all fixed in his mind. When children or families passed by, Roy stopped, hiding in the shadows, and watched intently. He considered himself a watchman not of the park, but of order, and this right order of the world included for him only those who fit his idea of real people. It was hard to miss the contempt and coldness in Roy's eyes when he looked at people of another race. A barely concealed hatred of outsiders, as he called them, had been brewing inside him since he was a child. He used to think that his contempt was justified, that he was in his right, and that such people didn't deserve to be here in his park. Today, like many mornings, Roy stood leaning on his broom and stared lazily into the distance, searching with his eyes for something to confirm his preconceived notions. When he spotted a dark-skinned figure, his eyes narrowed and a look of anger and judgment appeared on his face. He was certain such people were not supposed to be here with him. They seemed to him to violate the order he had established for himself, the order that he considered right. For Roy, it was not just a job, it was an opportunity to show his resentment, his latent aggression, but under the guise of supposedly caring for cleanliness and order. He could avoid making eye contact with those who were not like him, could avoid responding to their words or helping them. His contempt was cold and absolute, and he was proud of it as a value that no one could take away from him. This park was his territory, his domain, where he made his rules. When he looked around the empty path again, his eyes narrowed as he noticed a small figure in the distance, a girl with dark skin, a brightly colored jacket, neatly braided pigtails. She was treading the path and looking around curiously. Not even knowing her, could already feel the hatred boiling up inside him. He didn't like the fact that people like her felt at ease in this park, walking along its paths, enjoying the cleanliness he felt he was creating for others. And his hatred, deeply hidden in his soul, was like a lump of dark, sticky fear, like a sense of self-righteousness that needed to be unleashed. Roy straightened, gripping the broom handle a little harder than usual, his gaze heavier, sharper. He was in no hurry to approach, but he was already anticipating the moment when he would be able to face this girl, when he would be able to let her know that she was not welcome here. He loved that feeling, the power to humiliate, the disdain with which he intended to hurl his barbed words at her. Inside him, the growing contempt and thirst for humiliation seemed to fill every cell of his being, preparing to erupt into what he considered his duty, his mission. The park was still silent, as if it had frowned, watching Roy take his first step towards his victim. The girl appeared at the edge of the alley, where the trees were closely clustered, leaving only a narrow passage. She walked cautiously, as if nature itself urged her to walk slowly, absorbing every detail of the morning landscape. She was very young, scarcely more than 10 years old, and her eyes shone with that serene curiosity with which children look at the world, knowing neither malice nor prejudice. Her face was open, radiant and innocent, and she was carrying a small plush toy that dangled in her hands, responding to her every step. The girl looked as if she were a guest here, full of joy and delight. Her brightly colored jacket stood out against the muted fall colors, like an oasis of warmth in the cold and silent morning. Her steps were light, as if she could take off at any second without touching the ground. Her eyes reflected like the light of childhood, of freedom and serenity. She was completely serene, not even aware that someone was watching her every move with intense, hidden hatred. At that moment, Roy blended into the shadows of the trees, as if the park itself concealed his evil intentions. He watched her every step carefully, sensing something almost animal in him, a repressed anger, a cold prejudice that turned his gaze into sharp, piercing arrows. He saw only her distinction before him, her dark skin, her self-assurance with which she dared to simply be here, in his territory. Every move she made seemed like a provocation to him. He didn't like it when people like her came here, as if it were their place. This little girl, unaware of his presence, was simply enjoying the morning as if she had a right to do so, as if the world belonged to her as much as to anyone else. Her quiet presence, her warm smile and curious gaze only made him dislike her more, as if she were challenging his entrenched views by her existence. The longer he watched, the more the fire of contempt flared up in him. It seemed to him that her serenity was a mockery of him, of his labor, of the order he had so carefully guarded in his own mind. It seemed to him as if her mere presence here undermined his authority, his control, as if she, a mere girl, challenged his beliefs, his sense of superiority. Roy didn't notice his breathing getting heavier, his fingers gripping the broom handle harder. He couldn't wait to make the first move, to break her childish calm, to make her feel his contempt, to show her that she was superfluous. He felt a strange, dark pleasure at the thought that he could humiliate her as he had humiliated others in his life, those he himself had not understood and had learned to hate. That hatred lived in him now, seething in his every look, in his every movement. The girl, unaware that someone was looking at her with such anger, approached the flower bed and stopped. She bent down to examine the last flowers left after the cold night, her small hands lightly touching the petals without disturbing their beauty. Her world was pure and calm, and in that moment she existed in her universe, unaware that a dark shadow was ready to disturb her peace. Park fell silent, as if it was watching her every move, sensing the tension looming like a lurking beast. Roy watched the girl's every move carefully, like an animal stalking its prey. His eyes narrowed and his face took on a cruel expression. Every move she made caused waves of resentment and anger to spread in his chest like a heavy sludge. He could not and would not see her as just a child, as any other man would. She was something alien to him, something that deserved neither peace nor joy. He gripped his broom tighter and stepped forward a little, staying in the shadow of the tree. The janitor kept his distance carefully so as not to be seen, but he moved behind her like a shadow, following her every step. His gaze was a mixture of contempt and barely restrained anger. It seemed to him as if she were walking in his paths on purpose, walking over the places he had just swept. He was even beginning to resent her childish fun, her lightness, the way she was serenely touching the flowers and just enjoying the morning. Roy leaned against the tree again, watching as the girl made her way toward the fountain in the center of the park. He studied her judgmentally, squinting as if her appearance disgusted him. Her clothes seemed a bright spot to him, out of place and defiant in this place, as if she herself was a disturbance to the tranquility he had so falsely imagined. He didn't notice how his thoughts became more and more aggressive, how his judgment grew into a cold, almost tangible hatred. When the girl paused to examine the small pebble, Roy took another step forward, never taking his eyes off her figure. In his mind, this was his land, his park, and he decided who was right here and who wasn't. He didn't like the way she strolled carelessly through these alleys, as if she was just like everyone else. He felt he had to stop her, to make her realize that her presence here was an affront to his own order and peace. Another stranger, he thought, not hiding his disgust, as if they belonged here. His thoughts found no words, only cold rage pulsed in his head, reminding him of what he considered his duty to preserve the park for those who are worthy. In his eyes, she was alien, not belonging here, and her every move seemed to challenge his personal notions of order and cleanliness. Roy didn't even realize how his face contorted with indignation, how with each passing second, he became more and more determined to let the girl know that she was not welcome here. Roy slowly began to move toward the girl, like a dangerous predator ready to attack. His steps were sure and firm, each new step giving away more and more of his intentions. He deliberately walked, so that his heavy boots clattered loudly on the stone path, breaking the silence of the park. His face expressed a mixture of hatred and contempt, an emotion he had no intention of hiding. It was important to him that she realized she wasn't welcome in this place. Coming closer, Roy no longer tried to disguise his presence. He stood beside her, leaned over, and his shadow fell over the girl, casting a cold silhouette, disturbing her peace. She looked up, in her eyes, innocent and a little frightened, met his hard, piercing gaze, filled with dislike and malice, a look that told her clearly that she was a stranger here. "What are you doing here?" he growled, his voice sounding like a threat. Each word was spoken with a heavy accent of contempt, as if her very nature, her appearance, were an unforgivable insult to him. The girl backed away a little, feeling invisible walls shrinking around her. Her surprise and slight consternation only seemed to irritate him. He savored her reaction, that sense of power he hadn't enjoyed in a long time. Roy knew she was alone, that no one would protect her now, and that gave him confidence. He felt he could say whatever was on his mind, vent his anger without fear of repercussions. "Do you realize you don't belong here?" He spoke again, stepping forward, so close that the girl squirmed involuntarily. "Do you think you can walk in this park like everyone else? You think you can touch whatever you want?" His words sounded accusatory, as if he'd caught her in the act. There was a clear threat in his voice, and he enjoyed the way her shoulders involuntarily slumped. She started to back away, her eyes glistening with fear, but he kept his gaze fixed on her with cold contempt. Roy held out his hand and pointed to the path, as if he were kicking her out like an unwanted stain on a clean spot. He knew the girl had nowhere to run, and in fact the gesture only increased his pressure on her. He slowly looked her over from head to toe, not hiding his disgust, as if her appearance, her skin, was something dirty, unacceptable to him. His gaze was full in absolute condemnation. "Didn't you hear that?" he said louder, coming even closer. "You think you can walk around here and pretend you're welcome?" He stepped forward so close that the girl involuntarily retreated, stumbled and almost fell, but continued to look at him with frightened eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, why this grown man was so aggressive toward her. Roy saw her fear, her confusion, and savored every moment of it, feeling his contempt for her grow stronger. "I told you clearly, get out of here," he hissed, reaching out to grab her shoulder, emphasizing his words with a gesture that finally broke the atmosphere of childlike innocence around her. Giving the girl no chance to retreat or find any defense, bent over her, his face darkened with contempt, and the words, barely off his lips, sounded like sharp, painful jabs. "You think you can just walk around here like that?" he growled, his every sound soaked with anger and prejudice. "You think this place is for people like you?" The girl stood in front of him, clutching her toy, her eyes darting about like a hunted animal, but she still couldn't understand why this man was so angry with her, why he spoke with such hatred. Roy saw the fear and confusion in her eyes, and it only fueled his anger. He felt himself the master of the situation, the owner of this little corner of the world, and the girl seemed to him a stain on this picture that he wanted to erase. "Who the hell are you?" he continued, his voice breaking into a harsh, humiliating tone. "Do you think you're welcome here? You think you can just walk down these alleys?" He looked at her contemptuously from head to toe, as if her appearance were a personal affront to him. The girl didn't know what to say. She never experienced such an attitude, such a coldness that clenched her from the inside. Her lips twitched, as if she wanted to say something, but Roy wasn't going to give her a chance to speak. He savored his power, felt a dark, long-standing hatred rising inside him that he'd carried through the years. A hatred for people he considered different, alien, and this girl, her skin, her serenity, her naivete was as if she were adding fuel to the fire of his prejudice. Wasn't it explained to you that this place wasn't for you? He spat out with a chuckle, his eyes narrowing, and he stepped forward again, filling her space with his menacing presence. Or do you think you can just walk around like nothing's wrong, without anyone telling you where you belong? He was almost shouting, and his words cut through the silence like knives, robbing the girl of her peaceful morning, her innocence, shattering her illusion of safety. She tried to pull back again, but Roy was too close, too intrusive, surrounding her with his heavy presence. Do you think anyone here wants to see your kind? He hissed, the fury in his voice barely contained. People who don't know where they belong. Doesn't it even occur to you that you're not even here? Tears began to fill her eyes, and she squirmed, as if she hoped it could protect her from his words, from the hatred that seemed to take over the air around her. Roy leaned toward the girl with more disdain. His eyes narrowed and his face contorted with contempt. It seemed to him that all his anger and hatred had finally found an outlet, and it wasn't going to stop. He could feel rising from the depths of his being what he had been hiding for years, suppressing. But now, in front of this small, frightened figure, he let himself release all the brakes. Do you have any idea who you are? He hissed, and his voice was not only contemptuous, but downright humiliating. You think people like you can just walk around here and act like everyone else? Didn't they explain to you that people like you don't belong here? His every word was soaked with hatred, and he could see the girl shrinking more and more, struggling to hold back her tears. He savored her reaction, satisfied that she couldn't answer him, that her fear and confusion were literally restraining her. There was a mixture of rage and contempt in his gaze, and it wasn't going to stop. Do you think anyone wants people like you here? He continued, his words growing more and more aggressive, harsher, as if he were throwing a stone at her with each one. You think you're like everyone else? Look at yourself. Do you even see yourself? His voice grew colder and colder, crueler. He spoke each word with deliberate slowness, savoring them as if they were something sweet to him. He deliberately prolonged the moments of humiliation, taking his time, as if he wanted her to savor every word. Look at your skin, he gestured at her, as if her very appearance was something disgusting to him. Do you realize you're not like the others here? You can't be like the others, even if you wanted to be. You're not one of us, and you never will be. The girl stood in front of him, tears already streaming down her cheeks. She clutched her toy as if it would protect her, but Roy only grinned at her helplessness. He was pleased to see how his words were destroying her, how she couldn't find anything to say to him, how her innocence and trust in the world were crumbling under his attacks. You think your tears matter to anyone here? He threw with a chuckle, watching her face contort in pain at his words. No one here will sympathize with people like you. You're strangers. You always will be. There wasn't an ounce of compassion in his words, only cold, calculating malice, and he watched as each new comment echoed on her face, as she found it harder and harder to hold on. As her breathing became ragged with tears, the girl stood in front of him, her hands clenched involuntarily as if trying to protect herself, her toy the last link to safety and childlike carelessness clenched in her small hands as she stared at the face of this strange adult she had never seen before and who seemed to come out of nowhere to ruin her quiet and peaceful day. Her large, tear-filled eyes looked at Roy with incomprehension and pain. Fear paralyzed her, stiffened her movements, and she felt a chill run down her spine, as if the world that had seemed so friendly to her had suddenly become alien and hostile. Her heart was beating fast, and every beat of it seemed to echo loudly in her ears, drowning out the sounds around her. She could not understand why this man, whom she had never seen before, was so angry with her, why he spoke so harshly and looked at her with such hatred. She did not yet know the words to describe that look, that attitude, that cold contempt that enveloped her like a heavy blanket pressing on her shoulders. She was scared, but even scarier was the sense of confusion that swept over her whole. There had never been a moment in her life when someone had looked at her with such blatant disgust, as if her presence were an insult that could not be forgiven. The girl was afraid to move. Her feet were stuck to the ground, her hands were trembling, and she did not know where to hide, where to escape from that cold, hateful gaze. Her eyes began to glisten even more, and the tears she had been trying to hold back finally rolled down her cheeks. She couldn't understand what she had done wrong, why this man was talking to her like that, what could have made him so angry. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible, not even sure why she was apologizing, but her childish mind clung to any chance to appease his anger, to stop this torrent of cruel words. "I didn't know." She inhaled shakily, trying to hold back her sobs, so she wouldn't appear even weaker in front of him. But her fear was too strong. Her head lowered, her gaze dropped to the ground. She didn't want to see that face, those cold, angry eyes that seemed foreign and frightening to her. She didn't understand what was going on, why this man was doing this, but one thing she knew for sure: she wanted to run away, to hide, to find someone who could protect her from this stranger, who had suddenly become the scariest creature in her little world. Roy noticed the way her shoulders slumped, the way she shrank, trying to become smaller, more invisible, as if she wanted to disappear into thin air and vanish, to get away from this place, from his barbed, humiliating words. But Roy could only taste his power over her more intensely. Every fear she felt, every restrained sob, only fueled it, making his anger spill out with renewed vigor. He felt strong, invulnerable, the master of this little world, where he could make his own rules and demand of others that they obey them. This small, helpless child, pinned to the ground by his words and his contempt, could not answer him, could do nothing, and it gave him a strange, dark satisfaction. "I'm sorry," he mocked her whisper with a chuckle. "You think anyone wants to hear you apologize? Do you think anyone would ever listen to someone like you?" His words became more and more aggressive, and he no longer tried to hide his contempt. He didn't even think about the fact that she was just a child. He saw in front of him the image of everything he hated, everything he considered wrong, unworthy. The girl was the living embodiment of the hatred he had nurtured for years. And now that he could say it, he was not going to stop. "Do you really think you can just show up here like nothing happened?" he growled, leaning in so close she could feel his heavy breathing, see his face contorted with hatred. "No one wants you here. No one will tolerate the likes of you. You shouldn't be here. Do you understand that?" His voice was hard, almost cutting, and with each new word, he savored seeing the girl cringe under his gaze, her face flooding with tears. She tried to take another step back, but her legs felt like they were stuck to the ground, and she couldn't even make an attempt to move away, so tight with fear. Roy savored her helplessness, her defenselessness to him. He could see the confusion in her gaze, trying to understand why she was being humiliated. But he didn't care. He wasn't going to stop, and his words sounded more and more cruel. "Look at you," he hissed, barely above a whisper, but each word hit her like a slap. "You don't belong here. You always have been and always will be. No matter where you show up, no one expects you here. You're just tolerated until you do something wrong, and it's just a matter of time. Okay." Her face went pale, her eyes completely defenseless, as if she expected someone to come to her rescue, to save her from this horror. But the park remained empty and silent, and Roy enjoyed this silence, this atmosphere where his words were the only sound that penetrated her consciousness. Her hands trembled involuntarily, and she clutched her toy tighter, as if she hoped it would give her some protection. But Roy was adamant. He wanted her to remember this day, to remember her fear forever. He felt victorious, savoring the way his angry words shattered her small, naive world. Her lower lip trembled, and her face turned white with fear. She couldn't say anything, her voice trapped in her throat, blocked by the weight of his contempt. All she could do was stand like a hunted animal in the face of a hatred she could neither understand nor explain. Seeing that the girl was completely overwhelmed by his words, felt a new wave of arrogant satisfaction. It was no longer enough for him just to humiliate her. He wanted her to feel his place even more strongly, to make his contempt palpable, penetrating not only her mind, but her body as well. He wanted to make her feel not just fear, but the complete and utter realization of her defenselessness and unwantedness in this place. Slowly and deliberately, theatrically, he took a step back and looked at her from head to foot, as if her appearance disgusted him, as if she were something dirty and alien that had been brought here by mistake. His lips curled into a contemptuous grin, and he snorted defiantly, showing how little her presence meant to him, how insignificant she looked in his eyes. He reached out and shook the imaginary dust off his sleeve, as if her very proximity had left a mark on his clothes. The gesture was simple, but in it lay all his arrogance, his sense of superiority over her. She was nothing in his eyes, nothing. and he wasn't going to hide it. Roy grinned again and turned away from her, as if even looking at her was unpleasant to him. But then, as if changing his mind, he turned again and, leaning toward her, pretended to ward it off with his hand, as one would ward off something unnecessary and disgusting. His hand flouncy in the air, but the girl twitched instinctively, expecting that he might strike her. The movement of her small body, the fear in her eyes, made him feel even more powerful and superior. "What are you afraid of?" he said with a fake, contemptuous affection, as if mocking her fright. "Do you think anyone will help you? You're out here all alone. You understand? Alone, and no one cares about you." His hand came down sharply again, and he deliberately shoved her shoulder, not hard, but enough to make her stagger and take a step back, cringing even more and cradling her toy. He looked down at her, enjoying the way her face contorted with fear and pain, the way her eyes widened, filling with tears. Every gesture he made, every little detail of his demeanor was filled with that icy, prickly contempt. He raised his hand slowly and pointed his finger toward the park exit, not saying a word, but doing his best to humiliate her, to make her realize that he wanted her gone, out of his sight, as if her presence were something that spoiled the very air around her. "Well," he threw, raising an eyebrow with a mocking chuckle, as if he expected her to run away right away, leaving him alone in his perfect world. The girl stood before him, trembling with fear, but something inside her, maybe the remnants of a child's naivete, maybe the hope that this man still had a modicum of understanding or compassion, made her try to say something back. Her voice trembled, but she drew air into her lungs, straightened up as much as she could, and said it quietly, almost in a whisper, "I was just walking here. I didn't do anything wrong." The words were barely audible, but her childish courage, her earnest desire to explain herself, to defend herself, was in every sound. To Roy, however, it only increased his contempt. He smirked, and then burst into a loud, coarse laugh that broke the silence of the park. His laughter was barbed, mocking, and seemed to cut her senses to pieces, humiliating her even more. "Nothing bad," he interjected with exaggerated derision, as if her words were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "Do you think it means anything at all? That someone like you could do nothing wrong?" He gave her a contemptuous look, radiating an icy arrogance that trampled on her pathetic attempts to defend herself. Every word he said, every gesture, spoke of how insignificant he thought her to be, how absurd he thought her desire for an explanation was. He enjoyed her confusion, the way she tried to gather her strength and say something in her defense. "Do you really think your words mean anything?" he said, giving her a disparaging look. "No one here will believe you. You know, no one would want to listen to someone like you." His voice became increasingly rough and harsh. He deliberately increased the aggression, the mockery in every word, savoring her reaction, enjoying the way her face became more and more contorted with fear and pain. He felt like the absolute master of the situation, and this power over her, her helplessness, brought him a strange, cruel pleasure. The girl tried to say something again, but her voice finally shook when Roy burst into laughter again, loud, hurtful, like a whip, causing her to shrink back into silence. "I wish you'd just shut up," he grinned, giving her one last disparaging look. "The more you talk, the funnier you get." Roy looked at the girl with a gaze that focused all his contempt, all his ingrained hatred for those who didn't fit his limited idea of normal people. He stood in front of her, towering over her small figure, as if shielding her from the rest of the world with his shadow. His face was even more rigid, and his gaze was dark and prickly, as if the very fact of her presence here was a challenge to him. He took a slow step forward, coming so close to the girl that she could feel his cold breath. Roy stared at her as if through a glass, not seeing her as a person, not as a child. In his eyes, she was the embodiment of his prejudices, a clot of everything he'd hated for years, and that hatred was spilling out with renewed vigor, turning his every word into a weapon, a poison from which there was no escape. "Do you think you're like the others?" he said, his voice low, but in that silence, you could feel the full force of his contempt. "You think you can walk around here like everyone else? That's funny, because you don't belong here. People like you shouldn't be here." With each word, his voice grew harsher, devoid of any shadow of compassion. He said it calmly, almost mundanely, as if it were a matter of course, as if she really had no right to be here, not because she'd done anything wrong, but simply because of who she was. For Roy, there was no question about that. His world was divided into his own and outsiders, and the girl represented everything he didn't want to see, everything he despised. "Do you even realize that this place isn't for you?" he said, and there was a fury in his voice that he no longer hid. "You'll always be a stranger here, and you'll never be a part of it. The park, the streets, this city, it's not for people like you." He turned away from her, as if her presence offended his gaze, then cast a glance at her again, full of coldness and disgust. "Even if you pretend, even if you try to be one of us, it won't change anything. You'll always be different. You'll always be an extra. You can try all you want, but you're an outsider. You'll always be an outsider." The words sounded like a judgment, like a final decision he wasn't going to reconsider. There was no hint in them that he'd ever seen her as just a child, just a person. He looked at her with such coldness and contempt that the very air around him seemed to grow heavier. The girl felt as if the world around her had shrunk, narrowed down to his face alone, that evil, cold gaze, which had not the slightest sympathy, not the least bit of understanding. She couldn't look away, couldn't hide or retreat. His words, sharp as knives, penetrated her heart, shattering her trust in this place, in people, in simple walks in the park. She stared at him, and every moment seemed like an eternity, filled with fear and helplessness. Her hands trembled involuntarily, and her fingers clutched even tighter to the soft teddy bear, her only friend and protector at this moment. But even his touch, his presence, which had always given her comfort, now seemed powerless against the cruelty that poured over her. Her lips quivered, and tears glistened in her eyes, glistening like dewdrops, ready to burst and roll down her cheeks. She realized she had nowhere to run. The park, once her favorite place, where she had always felt safe and secure, was now a trap with no way out. Not a single person around, not a single familiar face, no one who could intervene, who could stop this torrent of hatred directed at her. She felt small and defenseless before this adult, before his anger and contempt. How unfair it was. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just out for a walk. Why was he so angry with her? Why does he say such terrible words to her? The tears couldn't be held back any longer, and finally the first drops rolled down her cheeks. She sobbed quietly, trying not to show her fear, but it was impossible. Roy saw her tears, her broken expression, and it only added to his cruel satisfaction. He savored her helplessness, her despair, her tears, which only seemed to confirm his rightness. "Oh, you're crying, too," he said mockingly, leaning toward her. "Do you think it will make a difference? You think anyone here will feel sorry for you? No, no one wants your tears. No one's going to help you." Every word sounded like a blow. The girl shrank, trying to make herself smaller, trying to hide from his evil eyes, but she was like a trapped animal, cornered. She knew there was nowhere to run. Her only wish was to disappear, to make this nightmare stop, to make his voice, those words, that contempt just disappear. But it went on. His words, his contemptuous gestures, his angry stare, it all seemed to press down on her, to choke her, to rob her of her last hope of protection and understanding. She could feel her face growing hot with tears, her heart beating faster and faster with terror, her breathing becoming ragged and ragged. She had nowhere to go. No one saw her suffer. No one could hear her quiet sobs. In that moment, her childhood world was completely shattered. Her trust in this place, in people, trampled under the weight of someone else's hatred. A tall figure appeared through the dense tree crowns at the other end of the park, where the sunlight broke through in soft golden rays. It was the girl's uncle, her only close person in this town, who was always there for her, always supporting her. Her uncle, a sturdy and confident man, was her protector, her support. He could always make her laugh, comfort and inspire her, and she knew that with him she was safe. But now she was all alone, surrounded by the shadow of the cruel janitor, and her uncle, her only hope, had not yet seen what was happening here. The uncle walked along the alley, unhurriedly, as if enjoying the morning calm, not suspecting for a moment that his niece, his favorite girl, needed his protection. His figure was distant, and he had a long way to go before he would see her. His calm face and relaxed shoulders gave away that he was completely absorbed in his thoughts, enjoying the rare moment of silence. With each step he drew closer, and his shadow, broad and sure, lay on the path behind him. He did not know that around the corner, in the shade of the trees, a scene was unfolding which would change his morning forever. There was not the slightest suspicion in his mind that his niece, whom he had always told that she should be proud of herself, was now standing before a grown man who was so cruelly destroying her faith in goodness and justice. His uncle was coming closer, his silhouette becoming more and more distinct, but for now he heard no sound, saw neither the girl, nor her depressed state, nor the angry janitor who continued to vent his hatred on her. For him, this morning was like many others, a morning when he could spend time with his favorite niece, talk to her, listen to her stories, maybe go for ice cream after a walk. He was absolutely calm and sure that he would find her in the part of the park where they had agreed to meet. But the morning had already changed, and with each step that brought him closer to her, he didn't know that he would have to see not her happy smile, not her joyous laughter, but eyes filled with fear and pain, and that his presence here now was needed by her more than ever. Roy continued to stand over the girl, savoring her tears, her helplessness, but suddenly something shook in his sense of certainty. It was a barely perceptible feeling, like a slight chill running down his spine, a fleeting, almost invisible shadow of unease that briefly broke his usual contempt and anger. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but something had changed around him, as if the atmosphere itself had become different. He glanced around, still feeling slightly uneasy, but he didn't see anything unusual. The park remained quiet, the alleys deserted, not a soul in sight, not a sound of footsteps. The strange sensation did not go away, however, as if someone in the distance was watching him, coming closer, but remaining out of his sight. The thought made him frown, but he quickly dismissed it, deciding that it was only his imagination, that nothing could break his hold on this place, on this morning, on this girl. But the uneasy feeling was growing stronger, seeping through his confidence like water through the smallest cracks in a wall. He felt it almost physically, as if the wind had suddenly changed direction, and the shadow under which he stood seemed to grow colder and thicker. He looked around again, but saw nothing suspicious, except the slight movement of leaves on the trees. Roy tried to ignore the feeling, focusing his attention back on the girl. Her sight, her tears, her fear still gave him this strange sense of power, but it wasn't so absolute anymore. It was as if something had upset his balance, his usual sense of control, and it was beginning to irritate him. He frowned, not understanding where the unease was coming from, but deciding it must just be his imagination, triggered by her pitiful appearance. And yet, he cast another glance behind him, lingering a little longer, his eyes squinting into the deserted paths. A girl, unable to hold back her tears any longer, realized she couldn't handle this on her own. She was cornered, her voice trembling, but there was desperation in it, a last, faint hope that her words could somehow influence this man, stop him. She looked at the janitor, sobbed, and said quietly, "My uncle, hey, he should be coming for me now. Please leave me alone. He'll be here soon." Her words sounded sudden, almost confused, but they had an immediate effect. Roy frowned, a look of slight confusion on his face. Uncle, in this park, he hadn't expected the girl to have someone around. Someone who could come to her at any minute. His eyes squinted for a moment, assessing her words, as if he was trying to decide if it was an attempt to defend himself or true information. Until this moment, he had felt completely confident, being here alone with her, in a park where he was a full-fledged master. But her words made him think for a second. He didn't like surprises, and the prospect that someone adult might be around to witness what was happening violated his sense of security. He wasn't used to anyone being able to stop him from making his own rules. Uncle, he said with a touch of disbelief and contempt, raising an eyebrow mockingly. Your uncle? His voice was sarcastic, but there was something more in his eyes, a subtle doubt. He stared at her crying face, trying to see if she was telling the truth, or if it was just a desperate attempt to make him feel sorry for her, to play on his emotions. But her eyes, full of tears and fear, seemed sincere, and something in her words made him look around again. He didn't want to believe that there really could have been someone around to stand up for her, but the anxiety he'd felt earlier was now heightened, and the thought that someone else might be entering his territory was driving him from a state of absolute certainty. La girl, noticing this pause in his aggression, inhaled convulsively, her heart beating faster. Perhaps the mention of her uncle could be her salvation. The moment the girl mentioned her uncle, her voice was so quiet that it was almost lost in the slight rustle of the leaves. But the janitor heard, and something in that simple mention made him look around nervously. His confidence shook, his arrogance faded a little. He still hoped, however, that it was simply the girl's attempt to defend herself, a maneuver to escape his aggressive presence. He brushed away the thought of real danger, forcing himself to chuckle, but a disturbing doubt crept in. Meanwhile, the girl's uncle, with his head held high and enjoying the fresh morning air, continued on his way down the alley. approaching the place where the scene was taking place. Nothing in his gait betrayed anxiety. He was absorbed in his own thoughts and expected only to see his niece running joyfully towards him. But his peaceful morning was already coming to an end. A few steps farther on, and his eyes caught the familiar little figure in the flower. His face contorted with fear and raced toward the man, whose menacing presence was evident from the first glance. The uncle stopped, his face stern, his gaze sharp and wary. He saw the janitor towering over the girl, saw her distressed state, her crying eyes full of terror. Something clenched in his heart. A mixture of anger and anxiety stirred within, and without a second's hesitation he quickened his step, keeping his eyes fixed on the man who still stood before his niece, with an expression of undisguised contempt. Roy felt a look on his face and turned around, his eyes meeting the cold and determined gaze of the girl's uncle. In that second he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. A slight breeze ran down his back, suddenly reminding him of the seriousness of what was happening. He saw not just an adult, but a man who apparently wasn't going to tolerate for a second what had just happened. Roy felt trapped in his own arrogance, his previously acquired sense of power and control instantly crumbling. His uncle came even closer, his step steady and sure, every movement expressing a restrained but powerful determination. He didn't say a word, his gaze spoke for him. Roy felt the fear creep into his body, chaining his muscles. Everything he had said so confidently and dismissively to the girl, all the derogatory words he had hurled in her direction, had suddenly turned against himself. Roy stood still, his smug grin gone, his face pale. He felt an unpleasant, almost icy feeling run through his body as the realization of his mistake came over him in a wave. Thoughts whirled through his mind. He had not just threatened a defenseless little girl, but someone much bigger than he had ever imagined. This little girl was not alone. Her uncle was a man whose confident presence, steady gaze, and genuine determination expressed something far more formidable than he had expected. Roy recognized the man. His face, his name, his reputation were known to many in the neighborhood. The girl's uncle was not just a grown man who had decided to stand up for his niece. He was a man of influence, a man of respect, a man no one had any desire to mess with. The girl's uncle had a high status in society and was known for his unwavering determination to protect his loved ones and seek justice. Roy, mired in his own prejudices and sense of impunity, this realization was like a thunderclap in the middle of a clear sky. He remembered the rumors, the stories of people who spoke of this man's strength of character, how he had always fought against injustice and defended those who could not defend themselves. Used to thinking himself superior to others, used to believing that his prejudiced views and aggression would go without consequence, now felt the ground go from under his feet. He saw the determination in the man's eyes that said he had no intention of letting this incident go without consequences. Roy looked away, his confidence evaporating, leaving only fear and confusion. He tried to calm down, mentally going over possible excuses, hoping to find a way out, but he knew that excuses wouldn't work. Everything he said, everything he did, was too obvious, too dirty to hide behind words. The girl's uncle took another step forward, and Roy felt his heart clench. He felt the weight of his mistakes, the horror of realizing that he had crossed the line. Roy stood frowning, his former self-confidence completely gone, leaving only fear and confusion. Panic grew in his chest, like a dark lump that grew larger with each passing moment, squeezing his heart and making it hard to breathe. His thoughts were racing frantically, trying to find some excuse, some way out of the situation, but he knew he would have to answer for everything he had said and done. He looked again at the girl's uncle, who continued to stare at him coldly, as if silently assessing the situation and weighing possible actions. This look left Roy no chance of escape or excuses. At that moment Roy realized that he had nowhere to go, that all his contempt, all his cruelty that he had poured out on the girl, was now turning against him. Every derogatory comment he had made, every derisive word he had uttered, all of it now seemed like a terrible mistake, a transgression that could not go unpunished. Despair began to shake him inside. He remembered the look on the girl's face, her tears, her fear, and now, seeing her uncle in front of him, he realized that he would have to answer for this act. This was a man who would not allow anyone to hurt his loved ones, and Roy no longer saw himself as a defenseless child to be humiliated. He saw his enemy as a grown, powerful man who could put him in his place. Panic swept over him. His mind raced, searching for excuses, 4 explanations, but each seemed weak and insignificant. How to explain the cruelty he had shown? How to justify himself to the man whose eyes seemed to penetrate to the very depths of his dark thoughts? Roy knew that neither words nor apologies could erase his guilt. Roy stood there, feeling the cold realization of his guilt come over him with unbearable force. All his arrogance, all his contrived feelings of superiority and contempt vanished, leaving only fear and bitter remorse. Before him stood the girl's uncle, towering over him, silent and firm, and behind him stood the girl herself, still trembling and with traces of tears on her cheeks. Her eyes, full of fear and resentment, reflected all the pain and injustice she had suffered. Roy realized that he had gone too far, that all the words he had spoken with such venom and mockery would never come back. His voice shook as he slowly lowered his gaze and whispered, I didn't mean to. I didn't realize. I'm sorry. But even he himself felt the weakness of his words. The girl's uncle didn't answer. He continued to stare at him with cold contempt, and that silence tore Roy up inside. He realized that no apology could erase what he had done. All of his derogatory words, his cruel taunts, had all been said deliberately, and now apologies sounded only like a cowardly attempt to avoid consequences. He realized that remorse had come too late, that trying to explain himself or justify himself now looked pathetic and pointless. Feeling the ground slipping from under his feet, tried to move closer, but the girl's uncle put out his hand sharply, stopping his movement. The gesture was a silent verdict, simple and unequivocal. He would not accept an apology. He would not let Roy get away with words. Roy realized that he was no longer in control, that consequences were inevitable, that this man would not let the pain he had caused his niece go unanswered. All he could do now was put his head down and admit his defeat, his guilt, but even that seemed insignificant. The girl standing next to his uncle looked at him with pain and fear, and he knew that this day would remain in her memory. His words, his cruelty, no amount of his pleas for forgiveness could erase that imprint. Realizing that he could not escape punishment, that his remorse was but a faint shadow of what he should have experienced before he had unleashed his hatred on the defenseless child, Roy retreated a step in silence. His shoulders slumped, his attempt to apologize, to justify himself, dissipated like an empty echo in the cold morning air. The girl's uncle spoke a few words in a firm voice that sounded like a final verdict. Now you're gonna have to answer. Roy realized that this time he could not escape responsibility. This man would not stop, would not forget, would not forgive until justice was served, and he knew that his future would now be colored with the same cold, bleak tones he had unleashed on this girl. The girl's uncle, seized by a wave of anger and deep concern, could no longer remain calm. The sight of her frightened, crying eyes and the traces of tears on her cheeks awakened in him a resolve that turned into a firm conviction that he would not let this incident go unnoticed. This wasn't just a case of misunderstanding or rudeness. It was a display of deep hatred directed at a defenseless child, and he wasn't going to let it go unpunished. He felt the fingers of his hands clench into fists, and every breath he took became heavy and measured, as if trying to contain the volcano of emotion that boiled inside. But the longer he stared at the janitor, who stood before him with his head lowered guiltily and hesitating to speak, the more his resolve strengthened. Thoughts flashed through his mind of how this humiliating treatment could break the girl's confidence, how his niece, so trusting and serene, could lose faith in the goodness of others because of one cruel man. Holding back his emotions, the uncle stepped closer to the janitor, now looking at him directly without averting his eyes. His voice was quiet, but it sounded even more menacing. Do you realize what you've done? Do you realize for 1 second how much pain you've taken for her trust? She's a child, you know. His voice got harder. Did you think it was just fun to humiliate her? Did you think it would go unnoticed? Uncle felt his righteous anger growing in him, and it gave him strength. He no longer saw the man in front of him. The janitor in his eyes became the embodiment of the injustice and malice he had fought against all his life. His voice did not rise, but it sounded so that each word stabbed into Roy's consciousness, making him feel guilty and helpless before the man who now stood before him. This girl, the uncle pointed to his niece, who was trembling but found the strength to squeeze his hand, feeling his strength and protection, has every right to be here, and you are not the person to decide what she deserves and where she should be. Roy felt the girl's uncle's words weighing down on him. He did not know what to say. His resentment and contempt, which he had considered normal, now seemed insignificant in front of this man, who was not afraid to look him straight in the eye. Roy realized that his uncle wasn't just angry. He was determined to get justice, to protect his niece and punish the man who had dared to hurt her. Uncle continued to speak. His words were like rolling thunder. You think you're superior, better. You think you have the right to say those things to her. Remember, no one has the right to demean another person for who they are, especially when it comes to a child. The girl, still holding his hand, felt that her uncle radiated confidence and strength, and hope began to flare in her heart that everything would be all right now, that he would not leave her alone in this terrible moment. The girl's uncle realized that talking to this man would not be enough. He couldn't leave the situation at the level of personal conflict. What had happened required intervention from the park management, and he knew he would do everything he could to get justice. It wasn't just about protecting his niece, it was about making sure that no one would ever face such humiliation and injustice again. He took the girl's hand and, with a reassuring nod, headed toward the park's main building, where the manager's office was located. The girl, still trembling, followed him, her small hand clinging to his, and her eyes, full of gratitude and relief, fixed on her uncle's familiar, firm profile. She felt his confidence and realized that now she was not alone. Her uncle was ready to stand up for her rights and demand justice. When they reached the office door, Uncle took a deep breath and knocked confidently, feeling his resolve growing. A muffled voice sounded inside, inviting them in. The superintendent's office was occupied by several park employees who were animatedly discussing work matters, but their conversations died down as soon as the girl's uncle stepped inside. His gaze immediately met the manager's eyes. He immediately caught the tension in the air and realized that this was not just a visit. "What can I do for you?" the manager asked politely, rising from his seat and gesturing for them to sit down. The girl's uncle did not sit down. He stood straight, with a serious, concentrated expression on his face, and his voice was firm as he began to speak. "This morning, my niece was humiliated and insulted by your employee." He looked around at the crowd, making it clear that this was not just a complaint, but a demand to investigate and take action. The janitor allowed himself to be insulted, threatened and humiliated based on her appearance and background. That is totally unacceptable, and I didn't come here just to complain. I want you to understand how serious this situation is, and I want this man to be held accountable for his behavior. There was silence in the office, and everyone in the room listened attentively to his words, amazed at the determination and firmness with which he spoke. The manager, confused by the unexpected situation, frowned slightly, shifting his gaze from the girl's uncle to the staff, trying to realize how serious this case was. "I understand your concern," the manager said cautiously. "Of course, I will personally look into this incident and take all necessary measures." But the girl's uncle gave him no opportunity to slip away. He leaned forward, his voice even firmer. "It's not a matter of concern here. This is not just an unpleasant incident. You have a person working in your park who thinks it's okay to humiliate and intimidate a child, and if people like that continue to go unpunished here, it won't stop. I want the park management to take responsibility and make sure that no one else is subjected to this kind of treatment." The manager hesitated, clearly sensing the tension and realizing that he was expected to take real action. He glanced at one of his assistants, as if looking for support or perhaps trying to shift some of the responsibility to someone else. But the girl's uncle continued to stand firm, not averting his gaze, his determination unwavering. He knew that now was the moment when he had to take concrete steps to make sure that this case was publicized and that his niece saw that justice would be done. "I want this man suspended from work while the investigation is underway," the uncle continued, "and I want you to talk to all employees about the inadmissibility of such behavior. I am ready to go further if action is not taken here." His words left the manager no choice. He nodded, realizing that the incident could not be hushed up or forgotten. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a demand for justice and fairness, and it sounded so sure that the manager had no doubt that this man wouldn't stop until he got his way. After the conversation in the park office, when the girl's uncle had firmly stated his demands, he and his niece left the building and headed for the exit. The girl was still holding his hand, but her eyes were filled with relief and gratitude. She felt safe around her uncle, who was so confidently protecting her. But this morning was far from ordinary. The uncle's words and determination had not gone unnoticed by those who had witnessed his speech in the office, and now people around him, as soon as they heard about what had happened, began to express their support. Several visitors to the park who had seen the uncle and the girl near the flower bed, as well as staff members passing by who had witnessed the beginning of the incident, now approached, cautiously inquiring of the uncle what had happened. The news that the janitor had allowed himself derogatory and abusive words to be spoken to the little girl spread quickly, and the faces of the people expressed indignation and sympathy. They could see that the little girl was still frightened, and the uncle, though he looked confident, was shocked by what had happened. "Is it true?" one of the women asked, looking at her uncle with concern. "Did this man really allow himself to say such words?" "Yes," the uncle answered firmly, looking carefully at the people gathered around him. "This janitor didn't just say offensive things. He threatened my niece and tried to humiliate her, but I'm sure it won't go without consequences." His uncle's words were clear and loud, and those gathered heard in his voice a strength and determination that resonated with each of them. They could not remain indifferent. One of the visitors, an elderly man who also frequented the park, shook his head with obvious indignation and added, "It's appalling that such behavior still exists in this day and age. This park is for everyone, and no one has the right to set their own rules or humiliate others here, especially not children." Other people began to side with the girl and her uncle, expressing support and willingness to intervene. Some suggested that the uncle write a collective statement or even involve journalists in the case, so that it would not go unnoticed. Outrage was growing among those present, and everyone now felt that what had happened was a challenge to justice and equality. That it was not just about this girl, but about everyone who visits the park, everyone who seeks respect and safety. "We're all with you," the woman with the child in her arms said confidently, looking at the girl with a warm, reassuring gaze. "We will not allow our children to be treated like this." A girl, seeing the people around her expressing support for her, their faces reflecting sympathy and concern, felt that fear and pain were beginning to let her go. All around her stood complete strangers, but all of them were ready to help. All of them stood in her defense. This feeling of shared support and unity was new to her, and she squeezed her uncle's hand tighter, feeling that she had nothing to fear now. Watching from a distance, realized that the situation had gone far beyond their personal conflict. His actions were now seen and condemned by the community, and he no longer had shelter from the gaze of these people, from their judgment and indignation. Panic came over him again, but now it was mixed with the realization of his total vulnerability to the people around him, to their unanimity and determination not to let this case go unchallenged. The girl's uncle nodded gratefully to those gathered and said quietly, "Thank you for your support. It means a lot to us. But the most important thing is to make sure that such cases do not happen again. We all want our children to feel safe and free from injustice wherever they are." The crowd of people gathered around agreed with his words, and some of them began to discuss how they could get the attention of the city administration or organize a group to monitor what was happening in public places. This incident was a reason for many of them to think about how important it is for everyone to feel protected and respected. A girl, feeling the support of all these people, realized that she was no longer alone. Roy stood in the distance, his face still red with shame and fear. The people around him, who at first knew nothing of what had happened, were now gathering together, expressing their determination and willingness to fight for justice. Their gazes were full of condemnation, and Roy felt every look nailing him to the ground. He couldn't take his eyes off the girl and her uncle, who seemed to have found the strength to go on despite everything that had happened. But for Roy, this moment was a moment of realization, a moment when the weight of his actions finally came crashing down on his consciousness. When he first began to threaten the girl, when the words came off his lips with such disdain and hatred, he didn't realize the severity of the consequences. He didn't think anyone would stand up for her. He thought that his power and right to insult would be endless, that his behavior would go unpunished. But now that everything had been revealed and those around him had begun to voice their outrage, he realized his mistake. He had behaved like someone who had no conscience or understanding that his every word was a blow to someone's life. The girl's uncle didn't immediately notice that Roy was near, but the girl, sobbing quietly, did notice his presence. He stood with his head down, and she felt that his gaze was not as hard now as it had been before. He looked confused and pathetic, but his eyes, though filled with anxiety, were still not completely clear of the contempt with which he had looked at her while he was in his usual role as in charge of this park. The girl's uncle turned around, noticing his approach, and once again stood as if behind a stone wall, ready to protect his niece from anything that threatened her. But Roy suddenly felt his legs grow weak and his hands begin to tremble. The panic he had felt at the moment of realization now turned into a feeling of true remorse, which was not just an attempt to avoid punishment, but a deep inner struggle with himself. He started to speak, but the words didn't come with ease. He felt real remorse, but it came too late. He began, and his voice was barely audible, shaking as if holding back tears. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would affect me like this. I didn't think. I never thought it'd get in like this. The girl's uncle, hearing him, inclined his head, but it did not allow himself to give the slightest sign of forgiveness. He could not forgive the horror Roy had inflicted on the girl, and there was not the slightest hint of sympathy in his eyes. He was willing to listen to the apology, but only to see how sincere it could be. He knew words couldn't erase what had happened. Do you realize what you've done? He asked quietly but firmly. His voice was full of determination. Do you realize how you've humiliated her? How you broke her trust? Do you realize that in that moment you were not a human being, but an instrument of hatred that chose the weak to assert its petty superiority? Roy could not answer. He wanted to say that he was sorry, that he realized his mistake, but now the words seemed empty and insignificant. How could such an act be atoned for? How could he give her back the innocence and peaceful existence she had lost when she faced his cruelty? His thoughts raced like lightning, racing through his head. He was confused. He couldn't believe himself, but one thing was clear. Remorse had come too late. He tried to make excuses, tried to say something that would make it up to him, but his soul was empty. All those years of prejudice and hatred that he had carried inside of him now came crashing down on him, and he realized that this was not just a rule-breaking, not just a mistake, it was a life lesson that he was now realizing through experience. A girl, seeing his confusion, still sensed that he was genuinely sorry, but that could not restore her calm. Her tears were no longer just tears of fear now. They were tears of despair and the realization that this world could not be relied upon, that there were others like him here, and no matter what Roy said, his words wouldn't change what she'd experienced. She was no longer the carefree girl who could walk safely through the park. The world that at once seemed safe was suddenly a place where she had to learn to protect herself from hate. Roy stood with his head down, waiting for words, but the girl's uncle remained silent, knowing that the punishment would not be in words. It would be in what would be done to this man, in how he would now live with the realization of his mistake. Roy stood there, his hands still trembling and his gaze still downcast. He didn't know what to do next. The words of remorse he uttered could not bring back to the girl the peace in which she had recently been able to walk peacefully in the park. There was still pain and confusion in her eyes, and he knew that his cruelty had left an indelible mark that no apology could erase. He was only a man who could cause suffering, but now he stood before that suffering and did not know how to atone for it. The girl's uncle was in no hurry to answer. His silence was not cruel, but resolute. He knew that words, even the most sincere ones, would not help. Roy tried to say something again, but his uncle interrupted him with a look of heavy but fierce severity. You've said everything you need to say, he said, his voice calm but firm. Now, it would be your turn to take responsibility for your actions. Your words are only the beginning. Now you must realize that such things must not happen again. You must change your attitude, an attitude towards such situations, if you are to ever look into the eyes of people who see you as a human being, not a threat. Again, those words penetrated Roy himself. He felt his gaze, which had previously concealed his regret, now filled with despair and the realization of the inevitable consequences. He finally realized that his actions had not only destroyed the girl's trust in this world, but had also destroyed his own opportunity to return to this world where people could forgive him. Without saying anything else, the girl's uncle bent down and took her hand. She looked at him with gratitude, but also with the realization that her trust had been shattered, and now she had to relearn to believe that the world could be good. As he and the girl walked back to the park, the uncle looked back and, feeling satisfied that he had achieved justice, realized that the lesson that had been learned today was a lesson not only for Roy, but for everyone who had witnessed the incident. The story of the girl and her uncle, who faced a vivid display of racism and cruelty, was a lesson for everyone. Hatred and prejudice are vices that should have no place in society, and they must be held accountable. As they left the park, Roy remained standing, his figure blending into the surrounding shadows. The park was filled with silence again, but this silence was different, a silence that left a residue of a lesson about human dignity, about how no person has the right to humiliate another, that you can't contain your hatred by turning it into words and actions that can destroy someone else's life. Everyone in that park, whether child or adult, learned an important lesson. Racism, aggression, and humiliation have no place in the world we want to see. Those who don't realize this must face the consequences of their actions, just as Roy faced the consequences of his. The girl and her uncle returned home, and the world was filled with light and peace for her again. But she was no longer the carefree girl who had walked through the park without knowing pain. She was wiser, and her confidence that she could handle any hardship was now bolstered by the fact that she knew there would always be someone who would stand up for her, who would do anything to protect her from injustice. She had learned to value support and strength, and that knowledge would be with her always. And for Roy, that day was a lesson he would not forget. He realized that his actions, his hatred, had not only ruined another man's life, but had destroyed his own future, and there might be no turning back for him. But he knew one thing: all his regrets and remorse would not bring back what had been lost. Friends, what do you think about this story? Leave your opinion in the comments if you encountered similar cases or seen injustice and racism in your life. We care about your opinions because each of you is incredibly valuable to us. We are very grateful to have you with us. For your support and your feedback, it is you who make our channel better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. It helps us create more of these stories. We appreciate each and every one of you and are always happy to see your comments. May your day be kind and filled with nothing but positivity.